1947. Europe lay in ruins. In the aftermath of World War II, millions were homeless, starving, and hopeless. Industry had ground to a halt. Cities were reduced to rubble. But across the Atlantic, the United States was experiencing the exact opposite: an economic boom. Its land untouched by war, its factories running at full capacity, and the dollar emerging as the new anchor of global trade, America stood tall. This dramatic contrast gave birth to one of the largest reconstruction projects in modern history. Known as the Marshall Plan, it was presented as a humanitarian campaign, but behind the curtain lay a far deeper strategic agenda. Was this truly an act of solidarity, or a calculated move by the US to secure global cultural and economic dominance? Many European intellectuals of the time described the aid as sugar-coated hegemony. Even within the US, some senators argued that the motive wasn't humanitarian, it was commercial. In this essay, we'll examine that question through historical documents and cultural insight. The war had ended, but peace had not fully arrived. Europe was not only physically devastated, the real crisis was mental and systemic. Economies had collapsed, infrastructure was gone, food shortages were rampant, and black markets thrived. People were not just searching for bread, but for hope. The greatest danger, especially from the American perspective, was that this desperation was making communism appealing again. The Soviets were expanding their influence in Eastern Europe. In the West, particularly in France and Italy, communist parties were rapidly gaining public support. For America, this was not just a humanitarian emergency, it was a geopolitical threat and an economic dilemma. Rebuilding Europe meant reopening markets for American goods, strengthening the capitalist bloc against socialist ideologies, and halting Soviet expansion. And so the Marshall Plan was born. While wrapped in the language of aid, it was in truth a carefully calculated economic and political stabilization project. By helping Europe stand again, the US could both rescue its own internal market and make its first major move in the Cold War. Along the way, it would also assert its cultural hegemony. Enacted in 1948, the Marshall Plan appeared, on the surface, as a $13.3 billion relief package for 17 European nations. But it was more than a bailout. It aimed to reshape Europe, not just physically, but politically, culturally, and ideologically. Through this plan, America exported not only dollars, but consumption habits, individualism, the American lifestyle, and even fast food culture. Consumption was reframed. No longer just about meeting needs, it became a way to shape identity. What you wore, what you watched, what brand you preferred became new markers of status and belonging. This wasn't aid. It was a meticulously crafted blueprint for dominance. As Europe rebuilt, it did so atop an American-designed foundation. Beyond the economic engine of the plan, perhaps the more powerful force was cultural propaganda. Through films, radio broadcasts, posters, and public relations campaigns, American values were steadily embedded in the European imagination. In countries like West Germany, the myth of American-style freedom, progress, and success was sanctified through cinema. And interestingly, this propaganda wasn't one-sided. European governments that accepted the plan actively encouraged their citizens to embrace these values. The result? Americanization became a voluntary identification. "You can be like us" was more than a slogan. It was a seductive invitation to a new way of life. In divided nations like Austria, the Marshall Plan revealed another face: a cultural battlefield. In Vienna, for instance, American cultural centers offered English lessons, screened Hollywood films for free, and hosted jazz concerts. Here, the US and the USSR competed not just militarily or economically, but culturally. While the Soviets adopted a harsh and doctrinaire tone, the Americans relied on soft power and charm. With radio shows, food packages, scholarships, and music, American values were not imposed. They were made desirable. A clear psychological divide emerged. The good Americans versus the cold Soviets. Minds were being won over without the need for armed intervention. The Marshall Plan seemed like a rescue mission for Europe, but at its core, it was about America's own economic sustainability. To keep its factories running, the US needed new consumers, and those European nations receiving aid soon became ideal customers. But this exchange was never just economic. It brought with it a lifestyle, consumption patterns, and cultural norms. The plan laid the foundation for NATO, inspired the early ideas behind the European Union, and brought American music, cinema, and ideology into the European mainstream. The American dream was no longer just America's. It became the dream of the entire Western world. Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci once argued that true dominance isn't just enforced, it's accepted willingly. The Marshall Plan is a textbook example of that. The U.S. exported not just products, but democracy, individualism, freedom, consumerism, and the cult of success. McDonald's became more than fast food. It became a symbol of the American way of life. Hollywood films were more than entertainment. They were cinematic sermons preaching heroic individualism, liberal ideals, and the mythos of America. So successful was this cultural export that American values are no longer even seen as American. They are now perceived as universal norms. Today, a new global force follows a similar path: China. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested in infrastructure across dozens of countries, using economic aid to gain political leverage. But unlike the US, China offers no cultural allure. According to Joseph Nye's theory of soft power, influence is not about force or money alone, but about ideological and cultural appeal. Despite massive investments, China has yet to inspire. The Chinese dream holds little emotional weight. Its model breeds economic dependency, but lacks mental or emotional persuasion. This is where the Marshall Plan truly succeeded. It offered not just money, but a dream, a lifestyle, a vision of the future. From social media aesthetics to fast fashion trends, from advertising strategies to Netflix narratives, many of today's cultural codes trace back to the Marshall Plan. Europe was rebuilt, yes, but also recast in a new cultural mold. And that mold was distinctly American. A fast food chain is no longer just food. It's a speed and individuality. An ad doesn't just sell a product, it sells a lifestyle. The whole world was taught to believe in a dream. And are we even ready to wake up?